Thank you, Peter, and thank you to YST Conservatory. It's been wonderful to be here these past few days. It's been a fantastic collection of talks and performances, and great to meet some of the composition students who just presented now. So, yeah. Look, Diana and I began collaborating about approximately 12 months ago via our mutual involvement in the Sydney Environment Institute. This is an interdisciplinary research institute at the University of Sydney that promotes cross-faculty collaboration on issues pertaining to our relationship with the environment. And this specific project, Listening to Earth, is born out of a collaborative fellowship with that institute and sits within that institute's what they call their environmental imaginaries and storytelling stream of activities. They do a lot of activities relating to climate change, obviously, but this one is particularly more in the sort of creative domain. As Peter's mentioned, Listening to Earth is focused on listening, connecting, and understanding our environment through the medium of sound. We hope to gain new insights into sound as both a medium of transmission and a vessel of knowledge for the storage of more than human memories. The project is framed from the perspective of posthumanism, which no longer assumes an anthropocentric orientation to truth. It draws upon the practice of deep listening as espoused by Paul and Oliveros, embracing notions of radical attentiveness and listening as activism, and positions the process as a dialogic language drawing upon Aktas Mäkelä, in which the earth is recognised as a collaborator. So in this project, we've been asking ourselves questions such as what emerges if we understand sound and the knowledge held within sound to be both a medium of transmission and a vessel for the storage of more than human memories, and is it possible through our sense of hearing to access a connection to stored and shared pasts, to deeply embedded stories held within the earth, and through these to a connection and deeper understanding of our changing environments. So in applying sound as our methodological tool, we hope to gain, as General Gil Murray describes, an enhanced understanding of certain topics, because sound appeals not only to the cognitive and the rational, but also gives space for associations, imaginations, speculations, and alternative forms of knowing. So we're hypothesizing that sound has the capacity to tell us more than we've ever previously considered possible, that the earth has stored vibrational memory and tells us stories, and that through communing with these vibrations and sounds of earth, we can perhaps begin to better understand what it has to say.
So, on the topic of methodology, you'll notice that the last few slides that have been up here have all been showing different coastal areas, and specifically, these are images of intertidal areas where the ocean meets the land on the eastern coast of New South Wales in Australia. Since Damien and I both work and live in Australia, this has been the focal point of our research. And most of the shots are taken from one particular area of beach about 3.5 hours south of Sydney in New South Wales. And it's a beach called Cudmera Beach. And we chose this point as a focal point for our recording, which we're about to tell you a little bit more about, because Damien has a personal connection there and we were able to spend significant time there doing work in that environment. Our approach to listening to Earth, this concept or idea, has involved a lot of experimental processes of deploying different types of instruments to listen to the Earth. And what we mean by that is we've been deploying things like microphones, what you see here, Exhibit A. We've been deploying things like hydrophones, microphones that are built to go underwater. We have been deploying things like geophones, microphones that have very low frequency response returns. So in the 50 hertz to maybe 250 hertz range. But we've also been building instruments that are meant to sound aspects of the environment. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that and to frame this a little bit in an acoustic ecology framework. So anyone who's familiar with acoustic ecology, the idea of listening and the sound specifically related to the environment, most of the work that we are doing is pertaining to the kind of what we call geophony, or the world of the earth and the environment. So we're looking at sounding the air or the wind, we're looking at sounding the water, and we're looking at sounding the ground or the earth or the sand. And that's where most of our experimentation for this project exists. What you're seeing in front of you here on the left-hand side are two images of an instrument that Damien designed and built called the sonovane, which takes the model of a weather vane that moves around to tell you the direction the wind is blowing, to capture wind that then gets filtered through pipes at the bottom of the sonovane to sound that wind. On the right, what you see is an instrument that's called the golden harp, which is an instrument that uses strings to sound the wind. Both of these are examples of Aeolian harp-style instrumentation that we've built to sound the environment. So we're going to play you some examples of what these sound like when the wind actually interfaces with the instruments.
So having collected a whole lot of recordings in a variety of different techniques from the earth, from the water, from the air, the question comes, what are we going to do with all of this material? And one of our first creative outcomes, or perhaps creative responses to all of this collection of the geophony, is to make a sound installation in which these captured recordings are recomposed and brought into a sort of controlled exhibition-like space to largely promote a deep, multisensual type of listening, engaged listening, where sounds that would normally sit beyond our usual thresholds of perception are brought to the fore. So in this sound installation, audiences are immersed in the sounds of these intertidal environments via a very enveloping spatial experience in super heightened detail. And we gently, throughout the work, traverse these different strata of air and water and land. Participants are also invited to sit or lie on benches through which low-frequency seismic vibrations gently pummel the benches to augment the experience and enable listening with the full body. The benches are pummeled through the use of bass shakers. So the very first iteration of this sort of sensory installation, Listening to Earth, is currently running right here, right now at the YST Conservatory as part of this program, of this symposium. And it's in the form of essentially just a 40-minute audio loop that's diffused via a sort of cube-style array of speakers, plus a couple of subwoofers, and as I mentioned, these bass shakers that gently shake you, so to give a very tactile sense of hearing. It's right there in that room, seminar room 3 on the first floor. So I encourage you to, if you haven't already, go down and come to both of these installations. They're nearby one another. If you haven't already, it will be up until about approximately the middle of tomorrow. And of course, it is our intention to actually continue developing the sound installation concept and augment this deep and intricate sound environment to include reactive projections, as well as pillars of illuminated rippling water that cast reflections around the room, as well as some translucent drums that are covered in sand and that pulse and vibrate to the low rumble of the ocean and create a delicate sizzle on the drum heads. We will play just a short excerpt. This is very much just a video of a work in progress, but gives you a hint perhaps of where we're heading with this installation concept.
Just to kind of dip back into the methodology very briefly before going into our findings on this project so far, what you just saw was a few different things, right? You saw examples of visualizations that were generated around similar material. You saw drum heads that were covered in sand that were using vibration from recordings of the earth to vibrate the sand, which was both creating patterns, but also, if you were to mic those, generating new sounds of the sand moving on the drum heads, right? So a lot of what we're trying to do is become very, Damien mentioned at the beginning this idea of dialogic exchange with the environment, right? Being in conversation with the environment in some way. And then, of course, we call this project Listening to Earth. So our focus is really how do we listen to the environment around us? Now, if you go outside the conservatory today, you can hear the cicadas really loudly in the trees, right? And you can hear a bunch of things that are happening in the environment. Maybe it's rain, maybe it's wind. But ultimately, when we're in those environments, we're usually able to listen to kind of an overarching sound. We hear a few things that stick out to us, but many of the other layers of sound we don't perceive well because we kind of get stuck into one general perception. So what we've tried to do is use spatialized sound reconstruction of multiple recordings. So maybe we took 20 or 30 recordings, a few from the water, a few from the air, a few from the sand dunes, a few from when the water rushes over the sand at the beach, at the shore, at the intertidal area. And we've reconstructed a space that uses elevation from the ground or below the ground to above the ground in the sky, which uses panning, which the students who were just talking about their project talked about panning very heavily. It uses a variety of different factors to replace each of these recordings in a particular spot in a cube environment. And so basically what you have is 8 speakers, 4 that create a cube above you, and 4 that create a cube below you. 2 very large, in this case, subwoofers that go boom, boom, boom every time recordings of the ground at the low frequency are sounded, and a bench that has these bass shakers that shake you as the low frequency sounds come in. And what's interesting, I think, for us is we're trying to bring attention and focus to all of these different sounds, and to do it in a way that allows the listener to connect with these aspects of the environment that we don't often have access to, because we're stuck in listening to kind of this higher level cacophony of sound as one thing, rather than the individual sounds that come out of that together. So, in the beginning, we said we were orienting listeners to deep listening practice, right? We evoked Pauline Oliveros and her philosophies around deep listening. And we're doing this in some ways as an entry point to create a type of empathetic connection with the environment. That's part of our motivation. We want people to feel more deeply connected, right? Whether you think of that as understanding or you think of that as having deeper levels of compassion or knowing. But what we've also said is that we believe that there is some form of storytelling that is happening in the environment without any human intervention. There's knowledge and story that is held there. And if you talk to people who are part of different ancient or traditional communities, they would say, yeah, of course there's knowledge there, right? And that's an understood, that's a given. And yet, in a lot of our kind of lives, we don't necessarily look toward the environment for that knowledge. So how do we record that? How do we then listen to that? And I think that's what concerns a lot of this project. The aim for the project around this environmental storytelling, we essentially wanted to create these outputs that become a part of a discourse that's happening right now about how we listen to the environment and what we can learn from it. And in some ways, this idea of dialogic exchange, I think we've explored it so far by way of using complex sound spatialization, and we've done it so far by way of trying to take these different parts of the environmental recording and placing them in relation to each other. I think for me, one of the biggest questions that I have is, what does it mean to try and present the environment through recording while recognizing our own role as performers in this process, whether it's performers through recording or performers through editing or performers through mixing the work itself. And that is an issue that has come up a lot in the symposium, and I think it's a very important one that Damien and I going into the environment, building instruments that we're using to sound the wind or to sound the water, choosing microphones, placing them in certain places, turning the recorder on at certain times, taking those recordings, editing certain things out, leaving certain things in, amplifying certain things, EQing certain things. Those are all aesthetic choices that, of course, we are layering into the process. But in many ways, our aim or our goal is to acknowledge that as part of this kind of dialogic exchange, but also to allow the environment and the sounds that are coming from it to be the thing that the audience can engage with, to be the message and the story itself. So again, this is in seminar room 3 downstairs on level 1. So we really encourage you to go sit. It's a 40-minute loop, stay for as long as you want, but invariably if you stay for more than about 5 minutes, the environment that you're exposed to will change. So if you don't like what you hear, wait 5 minutes. Thank you very much. If we have time, we're happy to take questions and answer them for you. Do we have time?
We do.
All right. Does anyone have any? Yeah.
I noticed you guys are adding like an additional model just hearing, like adding like sense of touch as well, like first and also maybe we can just strip over here, but maybe we can have like take away a sense, like maybe blindfold the people go inside to experience it more, or maybe like put sand on the floor so that they can have more feeling of immersion into the environment itself.
Yeah, an excellent observation, I think, and to answer this in perhaps a slightly contradictory way, I mean, I've had a long obsession with sort of vibration in the body and this idea of listening beyond what is heard with the ears, and that's led to often to the sense of touch. Touch as being an extension of sound. Obviously, we feel low frequency vibrations as much as we hear them with our ears, and I think with if you go and sit on the bench down in seminar room 3, you'll feel those low frequency vibrations in the bench. So there's definitely touch is considered more as an extension of the ear, perhaps, than another mode of sensation, perhaps. But we're also cutting a sort of fine line, I think, between, you mentioned a blindfold, so obviously that room is quite dark, so apart from a few little LED strips just to make sure you don't trip over, I mean, obviously we're trying to reduce the visual sense so that you can focus more with the ear. And indeed, that would probably be one of the rationales between taking this out of the environment at all, because I think when we're in the environment, we don't often pay attention to some of those delicate, detailed sounds just because of the sheer overload of visual stimuli. However, you're right, there are these subtle visual or visualizations of sound that we've been experimenting with, usually in reference to the source where these recordings have come, hence the desire to work with rippling water or sand that is vibrating on a drum head. But or visualizations that we may or may not do with a collaborator, Fausto Brusamolino. But yes, certainly sort of trying to dull some senses, but I think a lot of these visualizations are again connected with this idea of simply being able to perceive sound in ways that we perhaps are not habitually conditioned to do so. So draw awareness to sound in different kinds of ways. I hope that answers your question.